being around happy people can trigger a threat response. And so this is why nervous system healing really matters. And like we were saying before, this is how we got here.
Think about a moment when someone expected you to move really quickly to find the silver lining in your pain. That pressure to leapfrog from heartbreak into gratitude or growth can sometimes feel kind of suffocating, and it can lead us to bypassing or suppressing the grief, the anger, the sensations that we need space to move through. And then on the flip side, sometimes we can also get held in our healing practices, diving back into the experience over and over again as we try to grow. But post-traumatic growth isn't about rushing to meaning. It's about what happens in the nervous system when safety is restored, when the body can process, reorganize, and open to new possibilities. At the heart of this process is something a lot of people overlook: relational healing. Trauma isolates us, it erodes trust. It makes connection feel dangerous and dysregulates the systems that bond us to one another. But true growth isn't just about individual resilience. It's about the restoration of our capacity to co-regulate, to belong, to let others in to help shape our recovery. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the science of post-traumatic growth, what actually changes in the brain and the body, why people get stuck, and how nervous system practices create the conditions for authentic transformation. And we're going to look closely at why connection is essential, not just supportive for growth. Matt Bush will be joining us as we walk through a fascinating article that reframes how humans evolve to endure stress together and not alone.
We've evolved so much since season 1, not just because time has passed, but we've practiced integration in our nervous systems, in our bodies. Insight doesn't change the nervous system by itself. Healing happens when the body has a chance to reorganize through safety and through connection. And in moments when we are integrating, our bodies open in ways we can't think our way into. And where trauma completes, there's space for growth to begin. In this episode, we're exploring what post-traumatic growth really is and what it is not. Time doesn't heal wounds on its own, and resilience isn't about being strong. Growth is a neurobiological process that emerges when the body is safe enough to reorganize and when connection, both to self and others, is restored. Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide.
And I'm your co-host, Elisabeth Kristof, founder of brainbase.com, an online platform where we use applied neurology and somatics for personal growth, resilience, and behavior change. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification. And today we are joined again by Matt Bush from Next Level Neuro and one of our lead educators at NSI. So excited to have you here and dive into what I think is going to be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me back again. Always an honor. One of the reasons I care so much about this conversation is that for years, I thought I was doing growth wrong, like post-traumatic growth specifically. I'd hear people say things like, just forgive or don't let it bother you, just move on. And I kind of try to force myself there.
Mm-hmm.
And the truth was my body was still carrying the anger of what I had been through, just is simmering under the surface, right? So on the surface, I looked like I was moving on, but inside I was dissociated, constantly reaching for escape mechanisms and just shutting down emotionally. What finally shifted things wasn't willpower or forcing myself to change, but building capacity in my nervous system, learning how to actually feel safe enough to reconnect with those parts of me that were inside and with other people. Primarily, I did that through nervous system training. Only after that, I could feel that I could process and integrate and even feel gratitude for how those experiences had shaped me. Not necessarily that they happened, but the growth that came out of them.
Yeah.
And so personally, this is a pretty important topic to me. And post-traumatic growth is real. We're not fixed. We're not stuck. And it's not the way that it always has to be. But it does have to come through the body. Post-traumatic growth has to come with safety and often through connection with other people, not just in isolation.
Yeah.
I think Trauma Rewired is an ode to post-traumatic growth in itself.
Yeah.
It's testimony
Yeah. That this exists, that
that
we're
this
able to
exists
do
and we're
all of
sitting
this.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we're starting to talk about post-traumatic growth, let's outline a little bit of how this is traditionally described. So Tedeschi,
Tedeschi.
Tedeschi. So Tedeschi and Calhoun have kind of coined this term as a positive psychological change that emerges from struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. So there's 5 main domains that they look at this that arise with post-traumatic growth. There's greater appreciation for life, more meaningful relationships, interpersonal strength, recognition of new possibilities, and spiritual or existential growth. And as we start to talk about this, similar to what you were talking about, Matt, we don't want to start moving into this way that in order to have post-traumatic growth, we're saying necessarily that the trauma was worth it or that we have to feel good about the things that happened to us. It's about how we are creating the capacity to process and metabolize and move through that experience and see the dimensionality of it, right? That these things happened and there are places where there is a lot of big emotion and anger and shame and hurt. And at the same time, it was something that created who we are and created this podcast and the work that we do in the world. And really similar to you, Matt, I had a very, my experience, very similar to your experience when I was first beginning to do personal development work and really trying to create some change in my life. There was a lot of pressure to forgive, to not carry resentment. Like there were so many times I was told, if you're resentful, you're going to be harming yourself, you're going to move into
Mhm.
maladaptive patterns, you'll even be blocking the flow of money, like all these things that people say in the world of personal development. But at that time, I didn't have the skill to process the emotions of the event. There was big terror and rage and grief, and I was so dissociated and checked out from my body. What happened was I just kept repressing all of that, trying to fit this pattern of like,
Mhm.
I'm going to forgive, I won't be resentful, I can understand this other person. And it wasn't until I really started working with my nervous system and had the capacity and the skill to process those things that I was actually able to see the situation with more altitude in a different way, to have levels of compassion and honoring that there is real injustice
Mhm.
and pain in the world for not just myself, but for many people. And so it was a real process of navigating through that I think is so important to not keep pushing people into dissociation and repression.
I think you both just highlighted how sometimes post-traumatic growth gets veiled as like toxic positivity,
Mhm.
right? Because toxic positivity almost just forces repression
Mhm.
a little bit further and really honors that, right? As and that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about forcing performance and forcing resilience for others, and resilience isn't performative either. We can only kind of push ourselves so much, but this is about the nervous system's natural ability to reorganize safety and capacity together, right? And when growth is pushed too soon, it does lead to that suppression and shame and bypassing rather than transformation. Authentic growth requires space for grief and stabilization first, a full emotional experience, and even language for emotions. Trauma disrupts safety, so regulation has to come before we can expect a huge expansion, especially an expansion into forgiveness.
Mhm.
And once the body no longer feels under constant threat, curiosity and meaning making emerge organically. And that's a huge part of this. And it's a relational component is a huge part of this, right? Because trauma fractures connection. Post traumatic growth is often marked by a return of relational capacity, trust, co-regulation, and belonging. Humans are wired for interdependence, and our ability to repair relationships is not just a nice to have experience. It's a hallmark of true nervous system repair.
So, in my observation of working with clients, most people who experience post-traumatic growth, they almost always start with building body safety first,
Mm-hmm.
regulating their body and the nervous system. Because while the nervous system is running in survival mode, new possibilities just don't even feel reachable, right?
Yeah.
They're just unattainable. So that's why someone can hear all these positive messages in the world, but still feel stuck. And from the other side of the conversation, those statements, like Elisabeth, you were sharing, about resentment, they're not untrue, but they're so far out of reach,
Yes.
right? When we're still, bathing in trauma and dysregulation, they're completely unattainable. So they're not good advice, right? They're not false, but they're not good. But trauma doesn't just separate us from ourselves and from our future possibilities. Like you were saying, Jen, it also isolates us quite a lot from other people. And I think to a large degree, our society even makes it worse. We live in a culture that really prizes independence and strength and self-sufficiency. And if trauma already pushes us towards isolation, that message that we just need to forgive, or we just need to drop our resentment and the positive, toxic positivity, it just deepens the wound and pushes us farther away from other people that we could relate to.
Mm-hmm.
So when people regulate their body and nervous system into safety, often with neuro tools, and when they reconnect with relationships and they find relational safety, those are the two things that really allow growth to take root and for those 5 key domains to start to change and shift our perspective on the world.
Mm-hmm.
Something that was coming up for me when you were talking, Matt, too, about these things aren't wrong. They're just not right for someone at that moment. And then what happened, and what I see happen a lot, is then it just drives the coping behaviors because you're getting pushed more into that repression. So then, like, I can't stop binging. I can't stop numbing out. I can't stop dissociating or social media scrolling. And you're doing all of this work on self-improvement, but that repression is just happening more and more,
Yeah.
and you're not actually developing the skill. And then it is disconnecting you more from others because that shame of not being able to, and the emotional, like, you become more and more afraid of your emotions if they're the thing that is not going to help you grow to that next place. And so you disconnect more from others. You don't share that and have that connection as you're
Yeah.
going through
Because
it.
you can't trust their response.
Mhm.
They drive your dysregulation, and it really also is a huge block to trusting yourself. And so it furthers the disconnection that you are having with yourself too, about even trusting your experiences and where trusting the experience that you are living from.
Yeah, it's so hard to show up with vulnerability and to trust the very same people that are driving your dysregulation.
Mhm.
Because you're like, they're tasking me or advising me to act in a certain way. And if I show them who I really am, are they going to be disappointed? Is there going to be judgment and shame? So for me, that whole cycle just led to more masking,
Mhm.
right? The
Mhm.
advice from those people or those groups caused me to show up in like a performance manner. Like I'm going to put on a really good face. I'm going
Yes.
to act this way in public. And then in private, it caused me to be even more dissociated
Mhm.
because I'm not living in integrity and congruence with who I am and how I feel.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's just more and more masking that built up until eventually, I think for a lot of people, there becomes a moment of a crash
Mhm.
or a disconnect, or like, I just can't do it anymore. And they dissociate from that group and they pull away, and we get that isolation that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. That really resonates for me, of getting really good at performance until there was a huge crash
Yeah.
of everything. And that leads us into one of the most important aspects of post-traumatic growth that we're going to talk about, which is the relational healing component. As we know, and we have mentioned trauma isolates us, it erodes trust, it makes connection feel unsafe, and it dysregulates the systems that we rely on to bond at a physiological level. But humans are wired for survival and community. Nervous system healing is not just about building individual resilience, it is about restoring that capacity to co regulate. And you see this reflected in ancestral practices, drum circles, chanting, ritual, story circles. And these forms of regulation aren't new, but by any means. But for many of us, we've lost connection with that because of modern life, sensory overwhelm. We just don't have practice with those skills. We don't have access to that. And then also, too, if we are living in a nervous system where connection is really difficult, or being vulnerable, or expressing yourself in group, we can know that we want these things and we need them to be part of healing. But in those moments of entering into those spaces, we pull back, we disconnect, we maybe shut down in dissociation. So it's kind of like when we were talking in another episode about how I used to always describe myself as a ruiner, because I would go into these social situations I would really want to be part of, I would want to contribute, I would wanna be there for the experience, and I just couldn't. And so I would pull back, really isolate, and I think it came off as kind of aloof, and I would leave feeling really disappointed and really disconnected. And so we know that this part of healing is really essential for our growth, but again, trauma can make that really difficult. And so post-traumatic growth often reveals itself in this ability to reconnect, to find safety and belonging and intimacy and shared practices again. And there is a really fascinating research article that I'm excited to get into about why social connection is so important for our survival as a species. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. So this will take a minute to talk through, but it's so fascinating. And there's probably 4 or 5 articles that have kind of blended together to bring this to the podcast. But when most people think about stress, they picture fight or flight, adrenaline, cortisol, one person trying to outrun danger. But from our ancient human history, we actually see a different story. So if we go all the way back to the last ice age that humans actually lived through, right? So 20,000 up until about 12,000, 11,000 years ago, the Earth was kind of couched in this latest ice age. And there's long winters, food scarcity, bitter cold. And our survival at that time was like hanging by a thread as a species. So you can't survive a winter by yourself, right? Your survival at that moment doesn't depend on sprinting away from danger. It depends on groups that are enduring hardship together.
Mhm.
And so, what some of these research articles point to is that it was during that time that our production and release and synthesizing of oxytocin really increased as a species, the bonding hormone, right? So when your survival requires groups to endure cold, find food, and be in these long winters together, that's when oxytocin dominated the stress response, not adrenaline and cortisol. And it wasn't just for like empathy and warm, fuzzy feelings, but so that we could actually modulate our stress responses as a group and the physical outcomes from our health during those times of hardships. So, in a group situation like that, the higher level of oxytocin that is produced in a group dynamic allows us to conserve energy, to lower our survival stressors, even lower our vigilance. Like if you think about one isolated person in a cave during a blizzard, they're going to be hyper vigilant, shivering their bones off, like just trying to make it. But when there's a group together, it's not one person on the lookout. It's everybody collectively watching for danger. It's everyone staying warm together. It's everyone sharing food and resources. And so it allows us to collectively increase our safety and survival. Okay. So there's a couple mechanisms that I want to kind of talk about real quick in this. They're just so incredibly cool. The first one is co-regulation, which we talk about a lot. But we regulate each other's physiology, right? Infants literally cannot survive without it. And adults still need it. We rely on it with laughter, touch, synchronized breathing, like to help us feel that we're part of a group. Even shared labor can release oxytocin of a group working together on a common task. And when that happens, it also lowers our amygdala fear response. So the amygdala calms down, helps us to reduce stress and stimulate bonding at the same time. Second thing that happens, and we kind of touched on this, is lower threat perception. Like, it's not one person in a dangerous situation, but it's a bonded group that's reducing hypervigilance, calming one another, supporting one another on an emotional and nervous system level to conserve their resources. There's also a synchronization of group rhythms that occurs. And this is one of the really big ones for helping the nervous system feel safe because it makes the world predictable, right? Movement rhythms, circadian rhythms, even our attention, that we're all paying attention to the same thing, can be entrained to function together as a group rather than as individuals who are all in that one environment. And it helps to further reduce stress. So you can still see this today in the way that people unconsciously mirror body language and breathing and speech patterns to both signal that they fit into a group, but also to meet and accommodate others. Like,
Mhm.
it all meshes us together.
Mm-hmm.
So as humans, we're not really supposed to endure stress individually with just adrenaline and cortisol driving that activity. We're meant to really endure stress socially together with these support networks through this oxytocin bonding and co-regulation. And we've already touched on this, but in our modern life, like chronic isolation, fragmented communities, digital lifestyle, stress without this social buffering really pushes us into a lot of cortisol driven stress loops. And they're costly and they're really damaging long term.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at this in a practical way, what this means and the takeaway is that group rituals like chanting, singing, dance, drumming, community circles, shared labor, they're not optional extras for us to participate in like as just a hobby. They're actually protective to our health and our survival systems because they help us to build more of that oxytocin response. They activate those pathways, they create synchronization, and they help us regulate stress. So they're like these cool echoes of this ancient survival strategy that kept our species alive, but they're still active in us when we tap into them.
I love it. I think it's so neat,
Mhm.
really. And a few things come up for me because it is isolating, right? When you get on these journeys and it's intentional and sometimes, but this reminds me of like why pets are so important and
Mhm.
how having a pet to co-regulate with when you're at home and you are going through these
Yeah.
times that you do have something. And then eventually, this was how it was for me. And then eventually I was able to find community,
Yeah.
right? And like so much of the safety in my nervous system, safety and capacity also offered me discernment.
Hmm.
Right? So I would know that, oh, I could go into this group and are they placating me? Is this toxic positivity? Is this like
Right.
and then I can judge, like not judge in a bad way, but like we need
Discern, like
judgment,
you
but
said,
we
yeah.
have to discern who is the community that now we have sought after. What is their messaging and how is the health of their nervous system? So I think like NSI is so expansive in that way. And like just being able to trust myself into the community that I'm going in because like there's a real paradox here for the very thing that we need for growth is connection. And we can feel like that is also the most dangerous thing when our nervous systems are overwhelmed, like eye contact, intimacy, group rituals, and even laughter.
Mhm.
And being around happy people can trigger a threat response. And so, this is why nervous system healing really matters. And, like we were saying before, this is how we got here
Yeah.
in this place. So, restoring that baseline of safety is what allows us to tolerate connection again and even start to titrate it, right? And once that window reopens, healing becomes exponential. Connection regulates us. That regulation lowers our stress and the nervous system grows into more resilient
Mhm.
spaces.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting that it was one of the adaptations to like a really harsh state of the world that humans had to survive through is not just fight and flight, stress response, but oxytocin production
Mhm.
and our social connection network. I just think that's really crazy. I mean, fascinating to think about,
Yeah, yeah.
and puts so much um, deeper context to some of these rituals that you think about.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, like Jen, your example of the pet is a great place to start. I
Hmm.
love that because truthfully, it might be a little easier to co-regulate with a dog than it was with a human.
Hmm.
Mhm.
That
Totally.
distance and difference actually makes a huge change in how our nervous system responds. Um, we're gonna and a little later in this conversation, we're gonna talk about discernment that you mentioned. Like we need to have discernment to find out, is this the right group that allows me to actually feel safe? Or are they driving toxic positivity? Am I masking even more when I'm around them?
Mhm.
So I just want to tease that because we're gonna get to that in a few minutes.
One of the biggest things we see with our practitioners, coaches, therapists, even body workers is they know the nervous system work matters. They know it's the missing piece, but they're not sure how to bring it into their sessions in a way that's practical and effective.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, right? You hear all these terms: regulation, vagus nerve, interoception, modulation, and you're like, okay, but what do I actually do with my client sitting in front of me?
Exactly. That's why we're teaching a free 90-minute workshop called Integrating the Nervous System into Your Therapy or Coaching Business. Matt and I are teaching live for free to break down how to actually start using this work with clear frameworks, practical tools, and strategies for communicating it in simple, empowering language.
So, if you've ever felt like mindset or talk based work just isn't enough, or you're a somatic practitioner but you want to bring more practical neuroscience based tools into your practice to support your clients into deeper experiences, this is your next step.
Join us live on February 11th at noon at neurosomatic.com/integrate. A replay will be available, and that's neurosomatic.com/integrate.
But this whole idea of social bonding and oxytocin bonding for survival, I think when I've actually talked with clients about this who are a little hesitant to step into a community situation like that, what I've been able to share with them is start off in a passive role. Like just if it's a group gathering, maybe it's a meditation group, maybe it's a yoga practice, maybe it's a church where they're going to be singing or, a sound bathing session. Like go somewhere and just be in the building,
Hmm.
right? Don't even worry about participating. Just be an observer, be in the space and see how your nervous system responds. Like, does your nervous system become a little bit entrained in those rhythms? Does it start to catch the vibe and like be led into what that group is co-creating? Or does your nervous system kind of repel against it? Like put
Hmm.
your hands up, kind of throw up the defenses, and then want to run away, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because we've probably experienced both in different situations.
yeah. We want that in our nervous systems.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so sometimes discernment is just being in the space and listening, not auditory system, but listening with your whole nervous system
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
and finding out how am I going to respond to those particular rhythms.
Yep.
Like we have
Yep.
to find our space.
Yeah.
Hmm.
In a
Yeah.
minimum effective dose kind of way.
Right.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Like just starting out being passive, or like we've talked about many times on here, starting with a pet, or even like co regulating with nature and just
Mm-hmm.
being out
Mm-hmm.
and with the animals around and listening to the birds and putting your feet in the earth and having that be a space too.
Yeah.
So as we're talking about post-traumatic growth and this often showing up in our inability to reconnect, to feel safe and belonging, or with shared practices, we want to look at what is it that's happening in our brain and our body and our nervous system with chronic stress and trauma, because for many of us, trauma doesn't just block connection, it's reshaping how our brain and our nervous system operate. So if we are under chronic stress or chronic dysregulation, that can keep us locked into these survival modes. And then we're not able to access the pathways that are making that growth possible. And remember, as we have also talked about many times on here, trauma is not just the event. right? The event happens, but it's the pattern that gets woven into our nervous system and how our brain is predicting and protecting us afterwards. And our brain's job is to keep us alive, not necessarily happy or not necessarily moving towards our future oriented goals. And when our brain is predicting danger based on our past experience, it's keeping the threat systems active. It's keeping the stress response going even after the threat is gone. And so these trauma patterns or stress patterns become a part of the way that our brain organizes our sense of self. Our brain is linking these response patterns and painful experiences into a narrative at times. And that can become a narrative of, this is who I am. This is what I have to be to stay safe. It becomes linked with our identity. And then over time, those threat driven predictions stop feeling like patterns and start feeling like a personality trait or a truth about who we are. And I think this can keep us really held into these cycles. And I also want to talk a little bit here and just get your thoughts on this too, is I think it can also keep us in a healing loop
Mhm.
where we are constantly diving back in to do more work on ourselves, to have a deeper experience, just re-experiencing the thing over and over again. And it can become almost compulsive,
Yeah.
the drive to just keep healing, and it is, I think, also re-traumatizing at some point, and there's time to, like, take a step back, to acknowledge your wins, to let things breathe, to let the growth happen too.
I definitely agree with what you just said. And I think we see this a lot in Austin too, because it's such a huge, I mean, seriously,
Yeah,
there's a huge plant medicine community here, and
huge
there's
wellness
a
community.
wellness community even, but like in a medicine community, it's just like keep going to the medicine, keep doing this. But like underneath of it all, you're just bypassing your nervous system. You're never really stepping into a new pattern.
Yeah.
And it's really it is I think it's dangerous to do that, right? Like, it's not actually growth, and, like, people do have these identities that they hold on to, and it's like your nervous system safety allows you to kind of start stepping out of that, right? Like, we're trying to move away from this fixed identity, not continue to
Reinforce.
reinforce it. Yeah.
It's just like diving back in, another
Yeah.
program, another
Uh-huh,
this, another
uh-huh.
that, and putting yourself through those experiences at that intensity over and over and over again. It's like sometimes like just rest or play or just allow yourself to have some time to feel the
Mhm.
growth that has happened before you have to work on something else.
And I've witnessed a client that really masks in community, right? Her association into community and all these sisterhood things and this group and that group and this group. And it's like, there's no real work happening. It's just this idea of like, oh, I'm in community, so I must be doing the right thing. It's actually
Yeah.
not a client, it's a friend.
There's a subtle and almost sinister thing that happens when we make part of our identity of being someone who is still healing.
Mhm.
Mhm.
If that's my
Mhm.
identity, it's going to cause me to naturally get caught in the loop.
Mhm.
And the only way I can still be healing is if there's still an injury there.
Mhm.
If the injury wasn't there, I wouldn't be healing, I would be healed, and then I'd have to find a new identity. So
Right.
I say it's sinister because there's a secondary gain that's like beneath the surface. We don't want it. Either don't want to or can't express it in conversation or at a cognitive level. But it's like, what would cause the nervous system to get stuck in that loop is that there's ongoing threat and there's ongoing benefit from adopting and holding on to that identity. It
Mhm.
may not be growth, may not,
Mhm.
probably isn't post traumatic growth, but there's some kind of benefit that's continuing to come and it's re-traumatizing again and again and
Yeah.
again
Yeah.
to keep the drip going.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. It's like the connection. I have to be sick to connect,
Yeah.
to belong into particular groups. I need to be in a particular level of my healing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it actually just keeping you holding you down.
Yep. It's just as interesting to be in circles of people who are very proud of the healing that they've gone through
Mhm.
and they are healed And so it's very high masking, high
Yeah.
It's very high
high
masking.
performance oriented groups
Mhm.
Yeah.
where like everybody is now enlightened and healed and no
Mhm.
longer enslaved to their trauma.
Yeah.
I'm like, you're creating trauma as we
It's
speak.
true.
Yes,
Yeah.
totally,
Yeah,
totally.
it
It's such
is.
a balance, isn't it? Right? Like of not doing the toxic positivity and the like masking and also not diving into the thing and allowing that identity to be more fluid and to say like I have progressed, I have grown, I don't have to keep re-experiencing this over and over again. And I'm also a human being. I'm never completely healed or liberated or free. I'm just
Mhm.
living this human experience
Yeah.
and moving
Yeah.
through it, you
Yeah.
Big
know?
fan of authenticity over here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But, I think part of what draws people into psychedelics and plant medicines is because we know that the science points to this can dissolve some of that framework, right? The
Mhm.
DMN and like that quote of like my identity and the framework of how someone is living and like the idea that these medicines can loosen up the rigidity of a pattern and so that something new can map. But what we know is that through integration and with NSI, you have to walk a new pattern and that
Yeah.
has to happen really safely. And it doesn't always look like, oh, I'm just going to take off on this new path over here. Sometimes it's like I take one step, kind of need to stay here a few minutes. I might need to stay here for a little while and then do my repatterning. Then I take another step. And so I find it really interesting as we're talking about like having fused states as trauma identities. And I think people know that there's more, but because they bypass their nervous systems, they don't get to experience the moreness of what a lot of modalities offer.
Yeah.
And so, unless the sensory inputs change, unless the body is retrained to send signals of safety, those breakthroughs, they don't last. And integration is what really rewires the story. And it is all about the nervous system.
From the nervous system perspective, what keeps people stuck isn't that memory of the trauma,
Hmm.
but like what we're talking about is reinforcing those loops every day, right? So the nervous system outputs chronic tension, pain, digestive issues, emotional volatility, whatever those outputs are. But the outputs, unfortunately, the outputs become part of our identity sometimes. Like, I just don't sleep well. I have bad digestion. I'm an anxious person. And they start to feel like that's just who I am. And obviously, we know that's not true in the big picture. Okay. But what is really important to point out is the real driver of those outputs is that the sensory systems or the brain itself are still signaling that things are unsafe,
Mhm.
right? That could be an interoceptive system, vision, vestibular, breathing. If those inputs or the brain areas that integrate them are dysregulated, then the brain keeps predicting danger no matter what our conscious mind really wants to happen. So I've worked with clients who had years of talk therapy and community interaction and stuff like that, but like their sleep was wrecked, or their digestion was just a mess, or their anxiety was just through the roof. Once we started training their sensory systems and the accuracy of those inputs, then it helps their brain get more reliable inputs and it calms down those outputs and the threat responses,
Mhm.
right? So that's the key. If practitioners only focus on the thoughts and feelings and behaviors like the outputs, we're just going to spin our wheels and be missing the deeper driver behind it. So to really break the loop, we have to go back and work with the inputs.
So let's dive a little bit into what actually happens in the brain with post traumatic growth. If we have chronic stress, especially in development, the brain is swimming in the waters, the developmental waters of being organized around survival and the prediction loops that are keeping threat front and center. But post traumatic growth shows us the other side of neuroplasticity. It's not just the mindset shift, it's the measurable changes in the brain itself. And research is beginning to show how, with safety and with new inputs, like you were talking about, Matt, the networks that keep us held in these survival patterns can rewire toward regulation, different meaning making, deeper connection. And so let's look at what some of these changes actually are in the different brain networks. And this is going to be really similar to some of the networks that we talked about when we were talking about memory and learning and motivation. So there's increased connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, where we have memory consolidation and contextual memory. There's better regulation of the amygdala. There's less sensitivity and hyperactivity in the amygdala. There's greater activity in the default mode network supporting meaning making and future oriented thoughts. And there's enhanced insula activation tied to our interoceptive awareness and our ability to feel and interpret with accuracy the sensations inside.
In a previous conversation that we had with Matt, we talked about emotional regulation and impaired integration, and growth correlates with improved emotional regulation. We look at emotions as portals to growth and into this post-traumatic growth states that we're trying to highlight and lay out for you guys today. So this isn't just about thinking differently. It's about the brain learning new predictions of safety and connection, and that involves emotional um competency?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that a good way to say it? Emotional
Yeah.
competency?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's developing an emotional skill,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about all of this research is that it shows that growth is not just psychological, it's actually physical. So when you talk about neuroplasticity and myelinization of new neural pathways, that's physical changes that are happening in the brain, not just a change of mindset.
Hmm.
So when we practice safety and reducing threat and we practice new sensory inputs, we're literally rewiring the physical networks of the brain itself, which is why we call neuroscience the science of hope.
Hmm.
I think I say that on almost every episode that I'm on, but you just can't get away from
Yeah,
it, right?
it's true.
So what we see is that sensory drills play a huge role in unlocking all of these changes, right? When you reduce your sensory mismatch that's in the system by, say, improving your vestibular function or your interoception, the nervous system no longer has to stay in high alert, high vigilance. So now it's more accessible and it frees up the brain's ability to regulate these other networks, to do emotional regulation, to activate the DMN and the meaning making pathways, right?
Mhm.
All that stuff comes back online when we reduce sensory mismatch and have better sensory inputs in the first place. So when we're talking about post traumatic growth, it's not just feeling different, but it's about giving the brain new sensory evidence
Hmm.
that it's safe, that it can trust its reality, and then begin to shift toward the connection and relational integration that we were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love how you were talking about post-traumatic growth as being a physical change as well as beyond mindset. And I think one of the really important things to help that make sense for people is to really understand what is neuroplasticity. When we say neuroscience is
Yeah.
the science of hope because we're neuroplastic beings, what are we really talking about? And so we want to define it a little bit for people and get into some of the nuts and bolts of what's happening here. So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change its structure, its function, its connections in response to an experience. And we can't really reset the brain to pre trauma, but we can repattern. We can create new neural pathways that compete with and eventually override some of the old responses, the old well myelinated pathways that were driving our behavior. So, when we're talking about neuroplastic adaptation, we're really talking about creating changes in the brain activation and inhibition so that there's different relationships between what is being activated in the brain and what is being inhibited. And there's changes in what are the well worn paths. What ways can we have as options to choose to respond to a situation because we have reps of new experiences and there's not just one efficient predictive path for our brain to go down.
That's really important because it comes out of this understanding from neuroscience that all neurons in all brain areas are always active. So, in our colloquial language, when we're talking about neuroplasticity, sometimes we speak about, like, I'm going to turn off that area or turn on that area, but it doesn't really work like flipping a light switch.
No.
The truth is, all areas are always active and working together. So it's more about which area currently has more influence over the direction and patterns that the nervous system is going to enact.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a silly example, but it's kind of like our government in the United States. Like there's Republicans and there's Democrats. The government itself never really stops running,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just a matter of which group has a little bit more influence to drive policy and, activation of law and order in the direction that they want.
Mm-hmm.
But neither of those political parties ever shuts down its activity. It never just packs up and goes home
Right.
because it wants to be influencing what's happening in the government. So in our nervous system, there are no areas that just pack up and go home. Like when we're emotionally regulated and we're feeling really good, that just means we're leaning a little more in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But these old patterns of safety and protection, they still are there and they're still active until the point at which our brain finally has enough repetition in the safe zone that it can go, okay, it's been long enough. I don't need to hold on to those old patterns anymore. And eventually they'll be pruned away. But while they're still there, it's just about it's leaning in one direction or it's leaning in the other.
Mm-hmm.
And that understanding that can really help us dial in why is it so important to have a daily practice and
Mm-hmm.
ongoing tools to practice our regulation.
Yeah.
It is because neuroplasticity is the idea of like what we do, we get better at. So which road are you going down?
Mm-hmm.
Because you want adaptive plasticity, not maladaptive plasticity. So like I really like to look at the idea of neuroplasticity as like a really neutral kind of energy because you get to create the energy that you are moving
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
with it and into it. And when we talk about like the idea of unused pathways getting pruned away, it's not about resetting the brain to a pre-trauma state, but about building new, more adaptive patterns through repeated safe experiences. Like I was talking about a few minutes ago, you have to walk the path,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think sometimes people can get, um, what's the word? Like, they can get feeling a little bit of defeat sometimes because, like, I entered this work when I was almost 40 years old. I have been running those patterns for a long time. And that means I also have to walk the new pattern and show up consistently with my daily practice, with the idea of like this vision that I'm walking towards so that I can get up and do that every day. And then, like we're saying, then you wake up one day and you're starting to tick those 5 areas of post-traumatic growth that we started talking about, and you do find yourself in a new life post-trauma, and you can find forgiveness and you have different altitude on what you've experienced, because I wouldn't wish what I've experienced on anyone, and I wouldn't change my story either. And
Mhm.
we get pushback from that from some of our listeners, like, how can you be thankful about your traumas? And it's like, well, I wouldn't actually say like it's gratitude towards the trauma. It's not gratitude, but like I'm thankful for this phase that I'm in and to be able to find forgiveness and healing and create a life that I'm proud of and that I really want to engage with.
Yeah.
New connections specifically, and like rewiring that like social connection and understanding like the discernment that we're still getting into. And
Yeah. It also, I was thinking too, when as we're talking about like that the pathways, they don't just go away, they don't just vanish. And
Mhm.
um I was thinking it's also important to remember that because healing's so not linear and it's not always forward with momentum, and we can get
Mm-mm.
kind of stuck in shame too when we're expecting that. And even just the other day, I had an experience where I was setting a boundary with someone, and I've done a lot of work on my reflexive fawn response, and it was pretty neutral around it. And I was able to communicate well the boundary and put it out there. And at the same time, I then reflexively like backtracked on another boundary and was wanting to very quickly rupture any thing that might have come up in our connection,
Mhm.
right? So I was able to like set the boundary, but then I went reflexively into repairing the rupture. And at first I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to tell anyone that it had happened, but it's like it's still progress. Still progress to be able to set the boundary in the first place and I'm human and I have these well-worn paths and reflexive responses, and now I can just work through that and maybe have another conversation, or it's just okay to sometimes two step forward, one step back.
I think too of like this experience of us being in the studio, right? We're in studio this season, there's cameras, there's lights, and it's a bigger experience for us. And I don't think either one of us were really prepared of like how big this was. And my food patterns are the first patterns to come up when stress comes up, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, stress is getting high, but it just it's changed so much. I don't go into binges where I'm like in the grocery store eating everything from every aisle and like getting this big thing, right? But what I know about the stress of this experience is that I do need healthy snacks when I get in the car. I
Mhm.
need a meat snack when I get in the car. Like I have to prep for that
Yeah,
because
totally.
the stress is going to get high,
It
and
is
it's
high
not that
stress.
I'm not above my food patterns. I do not ever go into a binge anymore. Like that is old patterning, but the food idea
Mhm.
still comes up, right? So it's like I think of healing almost like a spiral. It goes up and it goes down. Like we go into the depth of ourselves a little bit more, but we continue to get altitude and it's like, "Oh, I'm here again."
Yeah.
But it looks different. And then you're like
Yeah.
in the studio and it's like, "Oh, I'm here again." It just looks really different.
Yeah. You can think about neuroplasticity as a spiral. You're either going upward along the spiral or you're going back down. Neuroplasticity itself is the structure of the spiral. It's neutral, like you talked about, but the direction you're going is kind of up to you.
Mhm.
Mhm.
This is why it's so important. And I know this is something each of you does regularly, like around the boundary conversation, you probably did what I'm about to say.
100%.
Around the recording situation, I know you did what I'm about to say, but it's this concept of using your tools to reinstitute a sense of safety,
Mhm.
Mhm.
right? To re-regulate your nervous system. The reason repetition and safety matter so much is because that's how we tell our brain this pathway is important. I want you to keep it. I want to be able to access it next time. And I want to be able to move through that stress in a positive way. Without repetition, the brain is going to default back to survival because it's more energy efficient. It's
Mhm.
the old pathways. They're
Mhm.
already myelinated. They're already very energy efficient to conserve what energy we have left.
Mhm.
And they're protective,
Yeah.
right? They're not the vulnerable pathways, they're the
Right.
protective pathways.
Right.
So when we're talking about trying to create post-traumatic growth, there's a phrase that one of my friends kind of coined this. They say progress is perfection.
Mm.
Not not perfection is perfection. Like I don't have to get all the way there, but just taking these baby steps. So whether we're talking about somatic drills or social engagement and relational connection, finding how we can help our brain to feel safe and then repeating again and again and again is how we can continue creating growth. And you two are both evidence of that.
Thanks.
As are you.
Yeah.
As are we all.
Here we are.
That's
Here
all
we
we
are.
are.
You know, I think one of the most beautiful things about being a human is that we are oriented toward growth. Like the nervous system, when given safety, naturally seeks completion and wholeness. And the body wants to discharge trauma. The brain wants one good rep, right? That's what restores balance and reconnection. And you see it in the way that wounds heal in our bodies, in the way that we long for connection even after betrayal, in the way that children play to metabolize stress. But here's where some of the myth creeps in. Just because growth is intrinsic doesn't mean it's inevitable. Time alone doesn't heal trauma. In fact, unresolved threat patterns often deepen. And forcing gratitude or finding the lesson too soon isn't growth, it's bypassing. Authentic growth honors both sides. The grief, the rage, and the fear must be metabolized, and the nervous system's deep orientation toward repair. Peak somatic experiences show us this truth. The body knows how to move toward completion when it's safe enough. Psychedelics sometimes amplify it by softening rigid patterns, but the through line is always safety and repetition. And that's how the intrinsic drive becomes lived change. So it's not that growth is a moral obligation, it's that growth is already in us and it's waiting for the right conditions.
Mentioning those natural desires and intrinsic drivers that we have reminds me of what I wanted to say about discernment.
Mm.
So this is a really good connection here. One thing that's really important for practitioners to understand is that it's super valuable to not only listen to a client's story about how they're feeling or what growth they're experiencing, but also to track their outputs.
Hmm.
And you can do this for yourself. It doesn't have to be a practitioner. But like, are they sleeping better? Is their digestion improving? Are they reporting less pain? Are they having more stable moods? So some of those things we briefly touched on earlier. And there's really two reasons for this. The first is that when we're in the healing and the growth process, we can forget sometimes that every healing practice or self-care routine or emotional tool also has a cost to pay in energy and resources.
Mhm.
It's going to cost some fuel, it's going to cost some time and some recovery. And so when we reach for more and more tools to try to speed up our healing, sometimes it can have a backsliding effect because we're overdoing it.
Hmm.
And while we may be saying, "Oh, I'm healing so much right now, I'm growing so much," it can turn into bypassing and we don't realize that we're actually more depleted and
Mhm.
we're
Mhm.
struggling because we don't have the resources and the fuel and the recovery time. The second is sometimes we push ourselves so quickly into vulnerability or forgiveness or gratitude, and the system is not ready to do those things safely. And so what outwardly looks like growth internally is creating dysregulation
Hmm.
or
Mhm.
dissociation.
Mhm.
But here's the thing, the nervous system will always tell the truth.
Hmm.
Those objective markers and outputs will still give the true picture of what's actually happening. So, in a very sarcastic way, please don't take this the wrong way, I tell practitioners that I train, stop paying so much attention to what's coming out of your client's mouth. Like, it's not the most important thing that their nervous system is telling you.
Hmm.
What's more important is the objective outputs,
Hmm.
right? And if we can watch those or even track those, then we can really see when there's a shift in a positive direction or when we need to slow down and restore safety instead of forcing ourselves forward. So that's the level of discernment that I was talking about earlier in the conversation, that like you can know
Yeah.
if this is good or not good, not necessarily by how you feel sometimes, but
Mhm.
by those outputs.
How your body and your nervous system responds.
Yeah,
I think it's good advice actually as a practitioner because a lot of times I have to look past what they are saying because they're not in their bodies and that's what we're trying to move into,
Right.
exactly.
right? Is the cognitive into the body. So sometimes they're saying things and I'm like, uh-huh, okay.
Yeah. I think it's really important, not just for practitioners, but for individuals too. Like,
Yeah.
be aware, monitor, respond, or monitor and track, like, how is my nervous system really responding? Are
Mhm.
there real changes in these outputs that I can measure? My sleep, my, changes in the behavior that I'm trying to address, changes in my pain, and like, what's really happening? How is my nervous system actually responding to this?
Yeah.
Not just because it's what I'm told will make me better.
Yeah.
What I keep coming back to is this: post traumatic growth isn't about forcing yourself into meaning or gratitude. It's about creating the conditions where your nervous system actually feels safe enough to reorganize and connect both to yourself and others. That becomes possible again. And growth often shows up in these really small shifts, like
Mhm.
you were talking about, Jen, like sleeping better, feeling less tension, laughing with someone that you trust. And those micro growth moments or those little tiny wins are the things that are pointing toward progress. So if you're listening to us talk today and you're kind of feeling stuck, remember you're not broken. Your nervous system is doing its best to protect you. But with the right inputs and safe connections, growth isn't just possible, it's what your body and your nervous system want, and it's the natural direction that they're going to go.
And I think too, like, if you're doing everything but regulating your nervous system and training it, like, please let this be the inspiration that brings you into our communities, whether you start at rewiretrial.com and you get 2 free weeks of live neuro training with brain-based, or you're coming into NSI as a practitioner. Like, I hope this is just a doorway that inspires you to know that we are a product of post-traumatic growth and like what is really possible when you bring in the nervous system, and just remember that it is a full neurobiological process, and
Yeah.
it doesn't just happen in our minds, it happens in our bodies.
Yeah. Thank you guys, and thank you so much for joining us. If this episode resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to any of our audio platforms or join us on YouTube.
Have you ever tried to explain the nervous system to a client and watch them become totally lost and confused? You know this is important work, but it feels complex, a missing piece that is too confusing to bring into your work, and it's hard to know where to start.
It's not that you don't understand the concepts, it's that translating neuroscience into simple, empowering language takes practice. And most of us were never taught how to do it. I hear from practitioners all the time. They know this is the future of their field, but integrating it feels too overwhelming.
That's why Elisabeth and Matt created this free 90-minute workshop to take the guesswork out of it. You'll learn how to sequence nervous system education, use 3 practical assessments, and bring this framework into your existing modality, whether that's therapy, coaching, or somatic work.
If you're ready to stop guessing and start integrating, join us for a free live workshop on February 11th at noon Central. Register at neurosomatic.com/integrate.